Understanding these different levels of risks then helps us to decide on what are the best approaches that we can apply for what risks. I would like to provide an example of climate adaptation, which is one of the approach we may apply in responding to the high frequency climate risks and low losses. I take an example of Tuvalu, where they were having decline in fresh water, both for domestic use as well for agriculture purposes. And this was a result of the rising sea level, which was just meaning that there were more saltwater intrusion and they couldn't have fresh water for their use. What the country did, they developed a program or project in order to help their island populations. And the focus of the project was to increase rainwater harvesting, to get fresh water from the rain and to store to the maximum extent possible. The project acquired or procured water tanks for the communities in order to increase the storage. That was one approach. And in another approach, the project also assisted the communities to develop raised cultivation beds for their crops, to put them a little bit far away from the saltwater intrusion. These two measures have been seen to work in the country, and the country is exploring how to expand this to respond better to the effects of the saltwater intrusion that they are facing as a problem. And these approaches have seemed to work, and the country is exploring how to expand these measures. I then go to the second category of risks, where I said these are low-frequency climate risks, but with medium to high losses. And in this particular case, I was making an example. Here I pick an example of Africa. In Africa, the continent is usually, especially sub-Saharan Africa, experiences frequent droughts. That can actually cause the collapse of the whole cropping season or the yield in a year. Many African countries came together, and currently there are 19 under what we call the Africa Risk Capacity. It's an insurance pooling mechanism where countries pay premiums into the insurance pooling mechanism. And in case one country experiences either deficiency in the rain or collapse in the rains not to come, then they are able to draw premiums or draw premiums from the facility to be able to rehabilitate their farmers and so on and so forth. And under these mechanisms, two examples, Malawi, for example, recently in 2017 also received the premium from the collapse in the rains as well. And these are some of the approaches that may be applied or used in case of these low-frequency events, but that cause medium to high losses. And in some of these instances, you may find that it might be difficult for individual governments or individual societies or communities to deal with them by themselves. And hence, that's why they borrow things like insurance mechanisms. And then there's the third category of approaches, where this is to do with coping, essentially, to put it in simple terms. Because this is where we consider those risks that have a low frequency of happening, but very high losses. But at the same time, because of their low frequency of happening, it is oftentimes difficult to invest any measures on how you can protect that. Think of a very severe storm as an example. In cases like this, you may find that then the government simply has to put in place relief support that may be put in place once such incidences have occurred. And it might be put by the government or the international community jointly together. I've just introduced the approaches on how we may go about adaptation to climate change. But actually, in order to truly make this to happen, one of the critical elements is to make sure that we integrate adaptation into development planning processes. And there are many ways on how that is being done. Many countries have done different things, and most of them seem to be working. Countries will create specific mandates, and here we talk about regulatory frameworks. It can be an act, or it can be a decree, or something of a similar strength. Instruments that would guide institutions at the national level on who is responsible for leading climate change adaptation work and what are the responsibilities of the different agencies at the national level, what should they do, how should they be reporting to the central coordinating mechanism, and so on and so forth. And coming to the institutional arrangements, they exist in different forms. Some countries have high-level institutional arrangements like a climate change council that is occupied by the ministers, for example, people at the executive level. So it becomes an interministerial force or council or a committee that provides guidance at the country level in terms of how adaptation is done. And in addition to these high-level committees or councils, for example, countries also create technical working groups that now look at detailed aspects. For example, we may have a technical working group that looks at water security, as an example. And that technical working group will bring in all stakeholders at the national level that are having anything to do with water, from the water supply, from the water treatment, water distribution. Countries will also create or establish specific technical working groups that focus on some of these things. And apart from the technical working groups, the countries develop plans or strategies that are actually aimed at assisting how climate change can then be integrated into the development plans. And such can be deliberate, independent plans, or it can be deliberate integration of adaptation itself into the existing plans to make sure that, for example, the National Development Plan puts climate change adaptation as the center of one of the key priorities of national development. And in addition to the plans, the countries may also have things like funds, for example. Some countries create dedicated funds in order to be able to fund climate change actions. I can pick a few examples. In the Philippines, for example, they have dedicated climate change funds for responding to the vulnerable peoples. So, all in all together, there are different ways on how governments are ensuring that climate change is part of day-to-day development planning and execution of activities to achieve sustainable development.